set for next Friday?
I guess. Yeah, I'm off, so we definitely can get out there.
Okay.
Well, good morning. I believe it's close to time. I'm out of folders, but I do have copies for today's lesson. If anyone doesn't have one and wants one, I'll leave some on each front pew, and feel free to come get them if you want one. I guess we'll start this morning with prayer requests. Just looking at the bulletin, there's several in there we need to remember. Are there any others? Miss Sylvia? Okay.
Yesterday, my sister Sarah broke 3 fingers on her left hand. She prayed for a child within his life had a stroke in one hand. He's got cancer, brain, stomach,
Okay.
Mike Calder, Sarah.
Okay.
Becky Roman that has good performance here.
Mm-hmm.
Her mother, Linda Master, passed away. A lot of people, if they ever went to Dr. Pruitt's office, she was the manager.
Okay.
And Linda had been with her for years and years. And she kind of passed away suddenly.
Okay.
A little small.
Prayers for me to longevity carrot surgery.
Okay.
And then I have a follow-up with the oncologist after.
Okay. So Miss Gloria and cataract surgery and follow up with her oncologist. Any others? Yeah, she's in the has been in the hospital according to the bulletin, so definitely need to remember her, as well as Miss Betty Aldridge. It says has congestive heart failure, and there are several others there. Murray Bridges, Dan Carr, Ashley McMinn, and then of course the Miss Emma Hadorn's passing last week. Right, yeah, I think I saw where Shelby's baby had a little bit of a setback, so her and then Mary Harbor's baby, definitely need to remember both of those families. They still got a long road ahead of them.
Amy right now too. Charleston's.
Right. Yep.
She's got breast cancer surgery coming up.
Okay. All right, if we'll bow and we'll begin with a word of prayer. Dear Lord, just thank you for this day you blessed us with. Thank you for allowing us to be here for this time that we have to spend together in your word studying. We pray you be with us through our study and then our worship a little later. We pray our worship will be pleasing to you. Dear Lord, we're thankful for this privilege of prayer, and there's many, as we mentioned, that are on our hearts and minds. We pray that you be with each one of them in ways that only you can. Dear Lord, just thank you so much for this day and for your Son. It's in his name we pray. Amen. Well, if you remember last week, we weren't together last week in this class. We had a guest speaker and teacher for us last week. The week before last, we spent time talking about Moses and his time in the desert. We talked about contentment and what that means. And then again, about his time in the desert and how, we all face those times in our lives in different forms and fashions. And we closed out talking about kind of how, looking at Moses and with us too, and the challenging times that we have, ways that we can respond to these, quote, desert times in our lives. The first one we talked about was the thought that I don't need it. kind of the, you know, a reaction of fear, maybe pride that, you know, why is this happening to me? I don't need this in my life. And we talked about how with that attitude, it's going to be difficult to learn and grow if we face those challenges with that attitude. The next one we talked about was the thought of I'm tired of it, which is similar with the, I guess, maybe main difference being might be someone who started out, you know, down the right path with a good attitude and the right response, but kind of fatigue or anxiety sets in, and after a prolonged time of dealing with something like this, you know, we can start having self-pity and start losing, I guess, faith that we're going to make it through whatever we're going through. In all of these, I guess, you know, if we think hard enough, we can probably find ourselves having those thoughts and feelings ourselves at times, and not having those thoughts and acting on those thoughts, I know is easier said than done a lot of times. And I think if we think about Moses and his 40 years in the desert, after the 40 years he had spent in Egypt, you could see how he could have possibly responded to his rejection in Egypt and his time in the desert in this way. But then the last one, which is what we closed on, we didn't really get time to talk too much about, is the attitude of I accept it. What does that mean when you think about that thought when facing challenges and maybe what we consider a desert time in our lives? The thought of I accept it. What does that mean to you? Right. It's, you know, an attitude that you can move on from and grow from. Is that meaning that you're giving up? Is that what the thought is there? Right. Yeah. It's actually the opposite of giving up. It's just being realistic, realizing that there are things that we can't control. Focus on the things we can control. Learn from it, move on. And if you go back to what we read when Moses first met Jethro and his family, what did it say about his attitude toward being there in Midian? Said he was content, right? He was content to stay there. And we talked a lot about contentment, and I think this kind of circles back to where a lot of times when we think about challenging times in our lives and this attitude of accepting it, and like Lee said, learning from it, moving forward, knowing we can't control everything, I think to some degree that is the definition of contentment, and that's how you can use contentment to strengthen yourself. It's being willing to accept the things we can't change, focus on the things we can, and again, having trust and faith in God that He's going to see us through those. I think that's where true contentment lies. Any other thoughts on that before we move on? I didn't want to rush. We kind of rushed through that at the end a couple weeks ago.
Sometimes I think you can be so content that you don't try to do anything about it. You're just so content with where you are.
Yeah.
And you can't get that way. Being a Christian, you can never be content. You gotta move forward.
Right. I think that's the fine line between contentment and complacency. If we get so, I guess, quote, content that we become complacent and we don't continue to try to learn and improve ourselves and do better, that's where you get over into complacency or being defeated and just giving up and saying, well, this is never going to change. I can't do anything about it, and you just quit trying altogether. It's a fine line there that we had to, be sure we don't get into that attitude. Which again, I think if you look at Moses, he could have, very easily gone that direction with his life. And it doesn't appear, as we'll see some today, it doesn't appear that he did that. and we'll continue with this thought a little bit, even today with some of the stuff we talk about, and as we continue looking at Moses. But if you turn to Exodus chapter 3, we're going to start talking about the burning bush event, which is one most of us are probably familiar with, but we'll kind of maybe look at it in a little different, maybe a little different perspective with different thoughts in mind. But if you back up to the end of chapter 2 is, where we were a couple of weeks ago about just a few verses we're told about Moses' time in Midian. But as chapter 2 closes out, you kind of somewhat have a transition from chapter 2 to chapter 3 with kind of an introduction or maybe foretelling of what's going to happen. And there it says, during those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. And I want to say we talked about this a little bit before, but it is a reminder there that God never forgets his promises. Even though these 40 years have passed since Moses came to Midian, he still remembers those promises. And he's, as we'll see in future instances, he's going to keep those promises regardless of Israel's behavior. Have you ever thought about the fact that God seems to specialize in restoring failures? Yeah. Yeah. And what are some, we're talking about Moses, and I guess, we talked about his contentment last week and this morning, and I don't know that that's one of the intriguing things about Moses. We're not really told much about what goes on in his mind and what he thinks, so you kind of have to look by his actions and such. It's easy to see where Moses could have seen himself as a failure at this point in his life, after making an attempt in Egypt to lead God's people and being rejected, and then now he's, shepherding someone else's sheep for 40 years in this Midian wilderness. You could see from whether Moses saw himself as a failure or not, I don't know that we can say for sure, but I definitely think we could say from a modern day secular viewpoint, from a career standpoint, where the world would probably say Moses was a failure. Would you agree? And probably even the Egyptians, because we talked about the attitude Egyptians had toward shepherds. So I would definitely say they probably saw Moses's life track at this point is not going up, but maybe down or at least plateaued. What are some other examples can you think of in the Bible of people who were possibly failures? Or at least we would, could, by the worldly viewpoint, would be considered failures. Yeah. Yeah, Joseph and his ups and downs, for sure.
And I think about like David, who by his own accord failed.
Yeah, and I think that's who Miss Dean just said was David, wasn't it? So David's definitely one. You think about the things that he did with Bathsheba and adultery, and then even to the point of he didn't carry out the murder with his own hands, but in his position of power, he was definitely responsible for that death. What about Jacob? What do we know about Jacob? What did he do to his own brother? Deceived and cheated his brother out of an inheritance, right? Deceived his daddy, yeah, and then cheated his brother out of the inheritance.
Think about as far as, you said secular worldly standards, I think about Rahab.
Yeah,
You know, the life she was living, but God chose to choose her,
Right.
to fulfill his
That-
plan.
that's true. What about the Apostle Paul? I mean, what did he do first part of his life? I mean, he was responsible for the persecution of Christians. You know, a lot of these people, these events in their lives, I mean, I think if we're honest with ourselves, if those type people were sitting in here today, we might have trouble sitting next to them, will we not? If we're really honest with the way we view sin and grading sin, whether we, you know, do it consciously or not. You know, these are the things that some of these guys did were pretty serious. And then you look at Moses again, as we talked about, you know, he went from Egypt, you know, to now Midian. So what does that tell us, you know, as far as we're concerned?
In all of those cases, God knew their heart.
Yeah,
Their mindset and their heart was more important than their bad choices and their actions.
yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. And those that we mentioned, you know, even David was referred to as a man after God's own heart. So God was able to use that, you know, for his purpose, and same thing with Paul, and even I think we'll see with Moses.
I think with Moses, the length of time that it took for God to, you know, for him to think that God was listening to him and to restore him. Sometimes we give up because it's taken so long in our mind, but God's, like these verses say, he hears, he remembers, he sees, he knows.
Yeah.
He's there, but it's in his time that he does those things.
Yeah, and I think we have to, like you said, we have to remember that, because, you know, in our viewpoint, we may see ourselves as failures, you know, whether it's in secular with our profession, or whether or not it's spiritually with the things we try to do, to where, you know, we're not as, or in our minds, we're not as successful as we think we ought to be. But we really don't know God's view of time and what he's got in store for us. So I think we have to keep that in mind, and not just stay content, not lose hope, and you know, keep moving forward. And
Our job is not to worry about the harvest. Our job is to worry about planting seed.
right,
And a lot of times we're planting, but we get anxious because we don't see any harvest.
yeah, and you know, as I guess as humans, and the way we function in the, you know, school systems, sports, you know, our careers, we look for results as a measure of how successful we are, which to some degree is you know, something to that, but at the same time, that's not always the way God measures things, is not always the way that, you know, we measure things. So we have to keep that in mind.
All of these people too, though, that we consider failures, they took their eyes off the prize.
Yeah,
They were within themselves. They were, you know, wrestling with issues themselves. They were not allowing God to lead the way.
right,
They were at one time.
yeah,
Where they turned to do so, but they were worried within themselves and they could think that they, you know, things like that.
yeah. Yeah, even Moses, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, he wasn't, at least with his attempt with the Egyptian and that was persecuting the Hebrew, he seemed to take matters in his own hand, and we don't see anywhere where he consulted God of what do I need to do here, or, you know, it was more of you could possibly see an internal thing, a physical thing, that he thought he was going to step out there and, you know, step up and take charge. So that's a good point. And we'll keep those thoughts going as we move forward. But let's look at starting in Exodus chapter 3. We're going to just read the first 9 verses, and then we'll come back and discuss. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called him out of the bush, Moses, Moses, and he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their suffering, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. So let's talk about this day that we've just read about. How did Moses' day start out in verse 1? Rick, what's that? He was shepherding. Just a normal day, probably just like every day's been for the last, how many years? 40 years. You know, he's leading Jethro's flock out. You think he woke up thinking this is the day something extraordinary is going to happen?
Have you ever woke up thinking that something extraordinary is going to happen that day?
No, I can't say that I have. You know, a lot of times what happens to us a lot of times, which could have been the same with Moses.
Start out calm, steady day, and then all of a sudden, something blows up.
Yeah. You know, a lot of us, we just wake up, you know, we know what we got to do today, right? We get up, fix our breakfast, get our coffee, we get the kids ready for school maybe. We got all these things, you know, our normal routine. And some of us, who likes routine? I mean, some of us like routine, right? It's comforting, and if that routine gets thrown off, what does it do to us sometimes? Yeah, it can be frustrating, can it not? And, you know, there's no indication here from anything that I've been able to study where God gave Moses any kind of warning that this was going to happen. You know, we don't see of God communicating with Moses prior to this point. So, like we said, he for all we know, was going about his day as he always had.
It looks like he was testing Moses to see if he would turn aside.
Yeah.
The bush is over here, Moses is over here.
Yeah, that's good.
He caught his eye and he turned and went to it.
Yeah. We're going to talk about that a little more here in just a second. You know, it makes me think, you know, I guess with this thought, what application can we apply to our lives before we get into what Mr. Melvin just said? Yeah. You know, we have to, you know, if you're like me that likes routine and planning out your day, at least in your mind, what does that do sometimes when we're headed to do what, and it might be something important that we're headed to do, and then we see something that needs to be done.
Sometimes you ignore what needs to be done and go on and do what you got planned to do.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily always the best thing.
Right. And so, you know, we have to be aware that, opportunities to serve God, they may come without notice. A lot of times they are going to come without notice, and may pop up in the middle of just an ordinary routine day for us.
Well, it makes me think of that, when in the Old Testament, the ox in the ditch, they were allowed to,
Mm-hmm.
just because of that, so.
Right.
That's what comes to mind.
Yeah, and we have to, be conscious and aware of that. So let's, verses 2 through 3, what about the bush? What was special about this, other than that, but the bush itself was it anything special about it? Just an ordinary bush out in the wilderness. How long, and there's no right or wrong answer, just get our mind flowing. How long do you think Moses had to look at it before he realized, because what did Moses realize about it that Mr. Melvin just said? It wasn't burning up. How long do you think he had to look at it to figure that out? Yeah, maybe not. And again, this is something, something he's seeing that's, maybe this ordinary day that he was starting out with, starting to not look so ordinary, right? So what does his response to the bush tell you about a little bit about Moses and maybe his personality? He was curious, wasn't he? What else maybe does it tell us about him?
My Bible says that God called him from within the bush.
Mm-hmm.
Really investigated.
Yeah. Yeah, and as Mr. Melvin mentioned, where was this bush in geographical relation to where Moses was heading? Yeah, God didn't plop it right down in front of where he was headed, did it? It was off to the side. So, we said he was curious, but what might some of us do if we saw something, burning that wasn't being consumed? How many of us would say, I'm going to go over here and investigate this?
Most would probably say, I'm gonna go the other direction.
Yeah, a lot of folks will say, that's a little strange. I'm going to back up and go the other way, or at least maybe go get somebody else to come investigate with me. So it tells you even all of Moses' past experiences and his defeats, his, quote, failures, and these 40 years of mundane, job of shepherding Jethro's sheep, there's still that curiosity and, you might say bravery, whatever it is, it's, part of his personality that allowed him to say, all right, normally I'd be taking these sheep this way, and this is my task, this is my job. And he could have justified, that has nothing to do with me over there. I got these sheep to tend to. I'm going to keep on about my day. What do you think God would have done had he not? Possibly would have found someone else, or maybe waited another 40 years, 20 years. We don't really know what God would have done. What we do know about God is when he has a plan, what's going to happen with that plan? It's going to work out, whether it's Moses or us doing our part or what. As humans, we're not going to be able to stop God's plan, right? So.
I think about Balaam, is it Balaam with the donkey?
Mm-hmm.
How many times did it take him to?
Right. Yeah. We don't understand stubbornness, do we? And yeah, Jonah was one of those on my list of when we were talking about failures. Jonah tried to be a failure as best he could, and God wouldn't allow him to. And just like we had said before, when we talk about opportunities to serve God, not only are they going to come unannounced, but kind of as we mentioned, sometimes they're going to come in commonplace situations. Moses is out here in this mundane desert that he's been in every day, and that's where God's appearing to him. And so, we have to be on the lookout for ways and those opportunities as they come up. Now, they may not come up as a burning bush to us, but that just means we have to be aware that opportunities to serve God are going to present themselves, and we have to kind of be conscious and aware of that.
If you look at verse 3, Moses said, "I must turn aside now."
Yeah,
So his curiosity, he had to go check it out.
yeah. Would you say, we talked about contentment and complacency. Had Moses gotten complacent? Even though he was content for these 40 years to serve Jethro, he still apparently hadn't become so complacent that he would, give up on, turning aside to see what this was.
Well, think about the excitement of that day for him. If you're a shepherd,
Yeah,
like, check this out.
yeah,
How exciting it's about to get. But I can see where he thought, let me see what's going on here. This is kind of a bright spot.
yeah. Yeah, and I think even if whether it was subconscious or not, like I said, something about his non-complacent personality, he was still open to this opportunity, I guess you could say.
He may have also been trying to protect his flock as well. I mean, like if you've got something burning on your property where you are taking care of other animals,
Yeah.
it may have been part of it too, and just trying to be a caretaker of the area.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't really know, interesting to think about exactly what this, because again, how long did it take him to realize this bush wasn't burning up? Maybe he sat there and stared at it for hours before he finally decided, well, I'm going to go see, but it is also the possibility that it was such an extraordinary sight that we can't really imagine what it looked like, and it immediately struck his interest to where he said, I got to go check on this.
So when you're burning a brush, hollow brush, if you got it on fire, it's gonna be consumed rather fast.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't going anywhere. It was
Right.
staying. So that
Yeah.
that would catch
Yeah,
your eye quickly.
I think you're right. And we already said, when did God actually speak to Moses?
After you turn the sidewalk off.
After he turned aside, because, so like you said, it seemed to be that God was somewhat testing Moses to see if he would come. And what was Moses' response when he called his name? Yeah. So you think Moses really understood at that point what was going on?
I'm gonna say no, but
No.
he heard his name, and he may not have thought it was coming from the bush.
Right. So,
He knew there was something different though.
right. So, I guess to some degree, what can we learn from that in our lives when God calls us to service or when that opportunity presents itself? Yeah. Do we have to understand every little thing we don't have to have all the answers, do we?
Well, I think about Abraham when God told him to go to another, to leave that country. God didn't give him any clue where he was going.
No, he just packed his stuff and headed that direction on the compass, didn't he? Yeah, it's, and that shows their faith for sure.
I think if you look back at all the situations, Abraham had no more confidence in God than Moses did.
It appears so, and I think Moses he's going to learn a lot here, and he's going to learn a lot in the next chapter, and it's to some degree, it seems like, to me anyway, with Moses' background, I think it'd be easy to see how there might be a little, I don't know if confusion's the right word, but you think about all he's been exposed to in the Egyptian culture, and I don't know that he quite yet has a full understanding of God, although he had a good enough understanding as we've seen in Acts and Hebrews, to where it was accredited to him as faith that he gave up his spot in the Egyptian court or whatever to instead be, low with the Hebrews, because he had a good enough understanding of who God was to be able to do that. But as far as, like you said, having as much understanding as maybe Abraham had, it doesn't seem that he does quite yet.
Can you imagine God telling you to take your shoes off, you're standing on holy ground?
Yeah. So what's the significance of that?
Where God is holy.
Yeah. Even ordinary things become significant when God's present. Would you agree with that? Yeah. So anything God touches, and that's something for us to remember is, we get hung up on our own personal capabilities and such, but nothing's beyond God. And how did, I guess, Moses respond at that point? Was he obedient? Yeah. So, there was definitely something to the sight of the burning bush, and then probably whatever the voice of God sounded like at this point. And we see that throughout the story of Moses with the Egyptians. It's hard for us to visualize and comprehend how impressive and mighty this was, I'm sure.
Exactly. Looking at all of this, though, in today's world, we got a Bible to talk to us. But the good Lord was talking to me out of the bush. I did whatever he said to me.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Think about it.
Yeah.
We talk about, we criticize how these people live and how they didn't do what God said to them. But God talked directly to some of these people, some of his leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And they obeyed. Now, some of the people behind them maybe did.
Right.
The good Lord was talking directly to me out of a bush or out of a rock or whatever. I guarantee you I'd be doing exactly what he said.
Yeah. That's a good point. Like you said, it was probably, and we get a little bit of how Moses felt probably here, in those some of those verses that we read, because at this point, I feel like Moses was probably figuring out who this was talking to him at this point. But if not, in the following verses, how does God identify himself?
He told Moses who he was.
Yeah, told him who he was. And specifically, who was he?
I'm the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob.
Yeah. And before he mentions those names, who does he refer to them as? Your father, talking to Moses, right? So if Moses had any doubt, identity crisis, doubt from his upbringing and how much time at this point had he spent with God's people, the Hebrews? Not very much, right? From all we can tell, once he was 3-4 years old, he went to live with Egyptians and was raised as an Egyptian. Now there appears to have been some connection with his family, because he knew who his family was, and when he hit 40 years old, he decided to basically renounce his Egyptian upbringing and consider himself a Hebrew. But how long did that seem to last? Yeah, a couple of weeks maybe. It doesn't seem very long. And then where has he been the last 40 years? In the wilderness in Midian, living with these Midianites. So if he had been having any kind of identity crisis of wondering, well, where do I belong? Where do I fit in? What is this statement that God just mentioned solidify for him? Yeah, he basically, not only is God identifying himself, but he's telling, Moses, who he is. So I guess, trying to make some application of that, what does that mean for us? Yeah.
We're his children. He is our father, so we need to make sure we understand.
Right. Once we become a Christian, and we're, from that point on, we're identified as a child of God, right? So that's how we should see ourselves and how we should conduct ourselves.
Well, he's introducing himself as well by explaining the compassion he has for Moses and the Israelites.
Yeah.
Saying, "I'm seeing the suffering
Yeah.
So he's showing him compassion from the very beginning.
Yeah. Yeah, and at this point, if Moses wasn't real sure, he definitely knew who he was talking to at this point. And then how did he respond? Hit his face.
But you know, you go ahead and finish the story of Moses, though. God took him up on the mountain, and when he come down, his face was so bright, they had to put a veil over it. So he's been, from this point on, he's gonna be with God a whole lot.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. His life is about to change, and I think
I think he understood because he said when God told him about all he had seen and done, and he wanted to take care of it,
Yeah.
Moses started figuring some of it out on his own.
I think you're right, and you know, you go from this Moses of where he's hiding his face out of, I mean, understandably out of fear, because we see that's a response that a lot of people have to coming in the presence of God in the Bible, and probably out of respect, and maybe you think maybe there's a little bit of guilt possibly with Moses. You know, we don't know. Maybe he might have felt a little guilt about some of the things he's done. But in all that, with Moses' response, did it stop God from communicating with him? No, God continued to talk with him and go on, like Lee said, and explain that he had, you know, still remembers the Egyptian, or how the Egyptians had treated people. So in all this, what are some things we can learn from this to some other things, you know, the last few minutes we have?
If we allow God, he'll use us in any circumstance he has for us.
Yeah, if we allow God to, he'll use us. Somebody over here have something?
I wonder if most of us go through life looking for a burning bush experience. And because we're looking for the burning bush experience, we miss an opportunity every day or every week to share the gospel with somebody who needs to hear it, or to serve people in some way, because we're still looking for the burning bush experience.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. If you didn't hear that, you know, some of us may be going through life looking for that big miraculous call, or the big burning bush, some big significant thing to call us into service, and we miss a lot of the little opportunities to serve God. I think that's a real good point. And with that in mind, I think we have to, you know, one, be aware that maybe like Moses, you know, we may not feel like and we'll talk about this a little next week, and when we get into verse 10, how maybe Moses' self-view might have been hurting a little bit due to his past experiences, but sometimes we don't feel like we're capable or maybe even worthy to serve God, and so that, you know, gets in our way. But, you know, we have to be looking for those opportunities. I say looking for the burning bush, but, you know, it's yeah, right. You know, it's not going to be a burning bush like Moses saw, but, you know, we have to be looking for those opportunities to serve God. And I think if you're a person like me that likes routine and has to struggle against letting things that get us off of our path that we're headed that day, you know, irritate us or whatever, we have to be willing to let go of those things when those opportunities do present themselves, and be willing to, you know, not saying we just don't take care of responsibilities we have, but I think if we're honest with ourselves, sometimes the things that we plan out in our day that we feel like have to be done could probably wait, you know, when a need arises or an opportunity arises to serve God. Deuteronomy 31:6 is a good one to keep in mind, and it'll kind of transition us into next week as well. And it's fitting that you know, and again, thinking about those other failures that we had talked about, that, you know, even if we have disappointed God in our past, or we've done things like David and so many others that we feel like maybe in our minds are unforgivable, and God is still willing to use us. In Deuteronomy 31:6, again, who wrote Deuteronomy? Moses. So this is Moses talking to the people of Israel. We've got 4 weeks left, so we're not going to make it to Deuteronomy 31:6. But, you know, those of us that know the story of Moses, you know, you see the growth, and you see him. He's reaching the end of his life, and he's about to have to turn over the reins to Joshua. And so he's, as part of his speech to the Israelites and encouraging them, he says, "Be strong and courageous, do not fear or be in dread of them." And this is referring to the folks that they're about to have to go to battle. He says, "For it is the Lord your God who goes with you. He will not leave you or forsake you." I think we use parts of those verses a lot of times as encouragement. You'll see people use them as little signatures on their emails or what have you. But in the context of this, you know, lesson this morning, that's something we have to remember, that, you know, if we're going about trying to serve God, that, you know, He's right there with us, and there's really no reason for us to be afraid.
He's got twofold purpose with this verse. He's talking to the whole people of Israel, and also to Joshua, to keep Joshua encouraged to make
Right.
sure he stays the course.
Right, yeah. He's turning a lot over, you know, something that he's been doing for, at that point, 40 years. So, again, goes to speak to Moses and his desire to, at that point in his life, to do things, you know, fully and correctly. Or any other comments before we close?
Maybe if we ask God every morning to use us today for His glory and His plan, that we would recognize what the future is more.
That's a very good point. It's definitely a good way to start your day out with prayer and asking God to help to use us and to help us recognize when those opportunities present themselves. It will definitely help get you in the right mindset to go about your day. That's good advice.
One more thing, kind of adding to that a little bit, is, you know, God may not speak to us through a bush no more. He speaks through this Bible.
Yeah, that's
Listen to what God has to say.
that's true. Yeah, that is the way. You know, as we've talked about, Moses is probably going to be one of those characters that God speaks directly with more so than any other, you know, character in the Bible or person in the Bible. But as Justin pointed out, the Bible is what we have to speak to us, and we definitely need to. As Pee Wee mentioned, you know, if God was speaking directly to us, not many of us would resist, you know, at that point. But, you know, we have to get ourselves in that same mindset, and then in our approach to the Bible is, you know, whatever it says in there, we should have that same, you know, reaction and action, you know, when we read those things in the Bible.
But he is speaking to us today, just not through a book, just through his word.
Right. Well, thank you for your comments. I think the little ones will be heading over here in just a minute. We'll pick up on verse 10 next Sunday, and probably won't make it much past verse 10. But we're going to continue looking at the burning bush and how Moses